Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Pension Awareness Month. My name is Catherine Murray, the Training and Engagement Manager from my CSP, joined today by Joe McLaughlin and Helen Shrimpton from the training team to help you get prepared for retirement. So today's session focuses on preparing for retirement as it comes to you. Sort of thinking about both the financial side of things, but also mentally preparing yourself for retirement as well, and all of the key facts and figures and things that you need to consider there. We'll touch on the 2015 remedy quite briefly. We did talk about that in quite a lot of detail on the session yesterday, Preparing for Retirement Part 1. So if that's something you want more information on, you might like to refer back to the video that's available now on the dedicated Pension Awareness Month pages of the scheme website. All of the events we've run so far have been recorded and are all available online, and today's session is no different. We will record the session and it will be available for you to watch from Monday. We will be taking your questions today, as we have in all of our other sessions, so do please feel free to drop any questions into the Q&A and the later part of today's session. We will be answering those, or certainly as many of them as we can, so please upvote the questions that you'd really like to see the answers to, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we possibly can. So I'm going to hand you now over to Joe to get things underway. So Joe, I hope you're ready for us. Over to you.
Hi, Catherine. Yep, certainly am. We're here to talk about retirement as we've just discussed, and I will share some slides that I will talk you through. There's a few things we'll talk through. Preparing yourself for retirement, we'll begin with. We'll have a think about the 2015 remedy, or McLeod, as you may know it, applications forms, support available for you after you retire. We'll also have a think about finance and legal matters, a bit about health and well-being, how to occupy time and coordinating lifestyle planning. So a range of things to do with retirement preparation in that respect. Retirement in itself brings a whole range of things to consider. One of those is obviously financial, but it's not just as straightforward as transitioning from the expenses that you have now into retirement. Those expenses are going to change for a variety of reasons. You'll be doing different things with your day, you'll be doing different things with your time outside of work, and your income and other things may be changing as well. And you'll need to consider those and what they look like in that transition to retirement in order to be able to plan effectively. And ideally, of course, that needs doing some time ahead. So some of the things that may be included within that are things like household bills. That may include things like decorating, particularly if you're moving or something similar, furniture and other costs like that as well. Weekly food shops, eating out, etc. Is your weekly food shop going to change? Are you somebody that had certain eating habits whilst you're in work, that might change in retirement? Are you going to be eating out in retirement? Will you be able to afford to do those things? Transport costs, particularly if you're somebody that travels into work, for example, is that going to change? Might you in fact be travelling more because you're travelling around to see friends, family, looking after grandchildren, or anything like that? Holidays and leisure activities, what's that going to look like? Things like clothing, footwear, personal care, what kind of clothing you're going to need? Is your outfit going to have a total overhaul to prepare for retirement? And then anything through to things like gifting, helping others, those kind of things as well. Now, the retirement living standards produce some figures on this to try and give people an idea about the kind of income they might need in retirement. And they do that in three broad bands: minimum, moderate and comfortable. Bear in mind, these are only ever there to give you an idea about where your finances might be heading. For you personally, it will obviously vary from this slightly. Somebody living in the middle of London, for example, is going to need a very different income to somebody living in the rural north of England, for example. It does give you a good idea, though, about what you might need. Now, they start off with minimum, suggesting that a single person might need 12,800 or a couple 19,900. The idea of a minimum standard is essentially covering all of your basic needs with a little bit left over for fun and social occasions. For example, a UK-based holiday, eating out about once a month, and also doing some affordable leisure activities about twice a week. Now, again, what your definition of that and how that ties up for you may vary slightly. Moderate is based on slightly more financial security, and their idea is having one foreign holiday a year, eating out a few times a month, and the opportunity to do some slightly more expensive and exotic hobbies in that as well. And then comfortable a lifestyle that allows you to be more spontaneous. You might have a subscription to a streaming service, regular beauty treatments, and perhaps 2 foreign holidays a year. Now, again, useful starting point. There's lots of exercises and things like retirement living standards can give you exercises to do to work this out more specifically, but it's well worth planning ahead and trying to have a think about where you want your finances to be in the future. Now, some of the things within that, again, this will vary person for person, and it's worth considering what you want from retirement as well as how these things are going to change for you in the transition to retirement. For example, keeping physically active. You may be wanting to pay for gym membership, classes, joining a sports club. You may be somebody that used to do those things through work. You used to have a gym nearby to work that you went to at lunchtime, or you may be somebody that used to walk to work or cycle to work. In that process of those things changing, how are you going to replicate that? Impact of lifestyle changes on sleep, diet, drink, and mood. These things all need to be considered, and they can have unintended or unanticipated consequences or impacts on your lifestyle. Sleeping, you may have had a routine tied around work. That's going to change. It's easy to slip into bad habits or those kind of things. How are you going to manage that? Might you maintain the same sleeping patterns? Diet, equally, again, may have been bound up with some things with work. It's easy to slip into bad habits in retirement. I remember my dad in particular being a little bit too proud of the fact that he could indulge himself during the week until he started putting weight on when he had to reconsider, which all his kids thought was hilarious. Drink, again, a lot of people might have a drink around the weekend. There's a temptation there to perhaps have a drink during the week. And it's interesting how some of these things have habits have changed as a result of things like lockdown and COVID. These things people have reevaluated through spending more time at home, working at home. Many of us may already have a bit of an insight into this already. Equally, mood. Lots of people may thrive on the social aspect of work, particularly if you do work in the office. And lots of people will look for different ways to engage themselves once they've left work. That might be with family, it might be with getting out and doing other things. Now, the NHS offer health checks, usually every 5 years for people 40 to 74. There's loads of good guidance from the NHS online as well. They offer all sorts of guides as to all these different things, as to things you might want to consider for all sorts of aspects of life. And like with anything like these kind of guides, you can take them as literally as you want to, but they are a good starting point to prompt a few ideas. Also, keeping mentally active, joining groups, societies, further study, brain exercises. There's loads of charities and organisations online that can give you ideas about things to do with yourself, both in terms of exercises, but also prompts about things that you might want to do. The Alzheimer's Society, for example, is great for that kind of side of things, and loads of information about keeping yourself busy. You may want to consider things like volunteering or part-time work. Apologies to anybody that's fallen off the chair at the thought of doing more work after they've retired, but for many people, it is. It can be desirable both in terms of keeping yourself occupied. For some people, it may be financially necessary. It's important to keep track of that, though, and keep things in check so that you're maintaining a healthy balance for yourself. Equally with volunteering, it may give you opportunities, A, to get out and about, but also for many people, it's a chance to indulge in hobbies or interests that they wouldn't have been able to whilst they're in full-time work. And things that can range all the way through from environmental groups through to local charities, etc. You've got that time and manpower to devote to something you just might not have been able to before. Along similar lines, there may be community projects to get involved with. Facebook, libraries, all sorts of social posting boards may help with all of these things. There's also the National Council for Voluntary Organisations that can help with these things as well. You can find these things quite quickly by Googling them online as well. Some people will indulge in further study. There's things like the Open University and U3A, which you may be familiar with. If you're not, it's the University of the Third Age, which is a charitable group that does all sorts of courses and activities for people after retirement as well. Travel, of course, you might be globe-trotting around the world or planning a few foreign holidays. All things to consider in terms of how you'll be keeping yourself busy. And of course, more time with loved ones. For some, that might be something you're looking forward to. For others, it might be something you're desperately trying to avoid in retirement. Again, it'll be personal to each of you. But some other things to consider within this. who is this going to affect? Your plan or a shared plan? Retiring with and around people around you in general is something that's well worth considering. And again, something that we saw through lockdown, that change of balance of how and when you're spending time with people around you can bring more tension. It's certainly something that's worth considering in terms of that balance. My parents, for example, my mum retired quite a few years before my dad. It took her a while to figure out what she wanted from retirement, and when she did, her single greatest fear was then my dad retiring, because it meant that he was then going to be around the house ruining all of her plans. And when he did retire, it did take them a little while to figure out a pattern that worked for them. They did bounce off each other for a little while, but then figured out a routine where they had different bits of the house for different days. So my dad, for example, has a room at the front of the house that he watches TV and lots of sport. Mum stays well away from there, not being a sports fan, and she has her own room towards the back of the house. But equally, they do things like childcare, gardening and shopping and things together as well. So they've worked out a balance that works nicely for them. The key thing is that didn't happen accidentally. It took some negotiation and time to get that figured out. The more open-eyed you can be going into that process, the better. Within that, as I've kind of just touched on, you need to allocate some me time. Make sure you're not just devoting yourself too far the other way, filling your day up and exhausting yourself in the meantime. Do some research on that, have a think about what you want to do, plan that out ahead of time in some cases where possible. Think about the timescales involved if you're wanting to get involved in something, and equally what kind of time you'll have to devote, what kind of lead-in time you might have, how long those things might last as well. Have conversations with anybody relevant, including friends and family, as well as organisations perhaps that you're thinking about getting involved with. Amidst all of this, you need to do some financial planning, of course, as well. The retirement modeler is a great way to start doing some forward planning. You can project your pension to all sorts of different ages. You can consider the impact of claiming early as well as later, taking more or less lump sum. Now, it's assuming you remain in your current job. The details on that modeler will be based on your most recent details from your last benefit statement. It gives a good indication of your future benefits. Essentially, the further you're projecting ahead, the harder it is for the calculator to be accurate, because we don't know what you'll be earning in 2 or 3 years' time, never mind 20 or 30. The closer you get to retirement, though, the more accurate those figures will be. And you can use that to help your retirement planning so that by the point you come to actually retire, you should have a pretty close idea about what the figures involved will be. The modeler itself looks like this if you've not seen it before. You can see a slider there to alter your age. It will warn you or not let you if you try to do anything that's not possible. Also worth noting, if you go for an early retirement age, it will automatically apply any penalty that's due. And we can see here the lump sum slider is set to 0, so we have a 0 figure up here. What you can then do is, as most of us would do, is immediately slide that up to 100% to see how much lump sum you can take. And it will rebalance your pension as a result. So you can have a play around with this to get a feel for what kind of balance you might want in the future. Do be careful when using this in terms of your planning. Have a think about what that monthly income is going to be in the future. And this lump sum can obviously get quite exciting in terms of the figures involved, and it is tax-free, but also that is going to be a one-off payment. You do need to think carefully about what you will do with that money. Equally, you need to also be thinking 10, 15, 20 years ahead even in terms of your income. What kind of money are you going to need to live on 10 years after retirement? And strike a balance that works for you. The right amount of lump sum and the right amount of income to keep yourself secure long term. Note that you can also play around with adding an increase on that year per year to replicate inflation or salary increases. And also this calculator will break down for you how much is coming out of each pension. In this case, we can see about £2,000 coming from the Nuvos section and 28,000 coming from the Alpha in this instance. Couple of limits on the modeler. It doesn't yet include the 2015 remedy, and it will be doing so. It may come into place before next April, but it will certainly be in place for next year's benefit statements. So those of you still in service beyond around about August, September next year, your modeler will show you your McLeod options, and it will show you what the current balance of those options is. Doesn't work if you leave the scheme without retiring. It's intended to show you what would be paid out at that point in time. Equally, it can't predict future or inflation pay rises, but you can add those little increases as we just looked at to simulate something like what you might be expecting. Equally, some scenarios may not be covered, and in those instances, you may need to contact us for further help. So just before I finish up, I will cover off a bit about the 2015 remedy or McLeod. Now, many of you are probably well familiar with this already. It's obviously been a big issue within pensions in recent years, and it is affecting a large number of our members. Now, the beginnings of this were the launch of a new scheme in 2015, the Alpha scheme, on the basis of reforming public sector pensions in general. So across the public sector, new schemes were introduced. For us, that was the Alpha scheme. And the original plan was that people would be moved over into this new scheme over a 7-year period. And that was going to be done on the basis of age. So between 2015 and 2022, the idea was that members would be moved across in batches into the new scheme until ultimately everybody that was still in service had moved across. Now, this was found to be discriminatory on the grounds of age. There was a variety of factors that came into play affecting different people in different ways. That was unanticipated originally. The courts, when challenged, agreed with the claimants, and as a result, this whole process needed to be revisited. Now, the 2015 remedy, on the back of the McLeod case, which was the most famous of those court cases, is intended to remove the discrimination that was identified. And the basic idea of that is giving people a choice about that 7-year period between 2015 and 2022, so that you can choose which scheme you're in for that period, rather than it being pushed through on the basis of your age. Now, one of the stages of that was for everybody to move to Alpha from April 2022, and that's already happened. So everybody is now in the Alpha scheme. At the latest, some of you may have been in for just over a year now, since April last year. Stage 2, to continue that process and rollout options, is still ongoing at this point. So who is impacted by this? Firstly, those in scheme on the 31st of March 2012 and continued through to the 1st of April 2015. There is rather more guidance about this and a calculator online if you want it, but that is the broad principle of who is affected. The remedy period itself is the 1st of April 2015 to the 31st of March 22. And for those of you who are affected, that is the period that you will get given a choice about. So essentially, your pension before 2015 remains in the same scheme you were before, and you're definitely in Alpha from the 1st of April 2022. But for that 7-year period, you will get a choice, and that will literally be an option A, option B choice as to which option you wish to take. For the period in the remedy, or the service in the remedy period, you'll be rolled back into your legacy scheme, so back into the scheme that you were in previously, and that will be the default position. You can then choose Alpha or your legacy scheme for the remedy period at the point of claiming that pension. That will allow you to make the choice accordingly, and you'll do that when you claim your benefits. Now, the first batches of this were for people leaving from October this year, so some options have already been issued. They will continue to be issued for affected members ongoing, and it's also worth bearing in mind that the calculator and benefit statements that we touched on earlier will be getting updated. So from next year, for those of you leaving a bit further down the line, you will get to see your options each year until you actually do need to make that choice. So for those of you who aren't leaving for a while, you will get the reassurance of seeing this several times over before you need to actually make that choice at that point.
Thank you, Joe. That was really interesting, really thought-provoking information to think about preparing yourself mentally for retirement particularly. It's a long way away for me, but still already thinking about it because I'd like to do it sooner rather than later if I can. So it's always worth being prepared as early as you can possibly be. We've had lots of questions coming through, so thank you so much. We're going to try and answer as many of those as possible at the end of the session. There's quite a lot of questions that have come through about the retirement living standards and what they're based on. The retirement living standards are put together by the Pension and Lifetime Savings Association. So we've put a link in the chat there to where you can find the information about how they've arrived at those figures. So if you'd like to know more about that, then they are the experts. So the link is there to their website where you can find further information. Now, something else that you might like to consider, we have our Pension Power webinars, which we run every single weekday. It's a 1-hour session that gives you an overview of the civil service pension scheme generally. And we run those to quite small audiences of around 30 to 40 people. So we will answer any questions that you have on those sessions. Today is with the large volume of people attending, we're not going to be able to get through all of the questions, but on Pension Power, we're always able to get through all of the questions that are asked. So something that you might like to consider, alongside pre-retirement planning courses, which are also available, but you would need approval from your employer to attend one of those, as there is a cost associated with that, but your employer will generally cover that for you on your behalf. So we're going to continue on looking at the retirement process now. So I'm going to hand you over to Helen, who's going to guide you through the process when the time does come to actually retire. So over to you now, Helen.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Thanks, Joe. Lots of good information there to think about before you actually come to retire. The section I'm going to talk about is sort of like the practical work that you'll need to do when you actually come to retire. And we're going to have a little focus on the application forms and sort of the member journey that someone will go on when they are ready to take that step to retirement. So here we've got a bit of a flow chart just to show you in terms of timescales of how long things take and what your responsibilities are when it comes to retirement. So this is general information. Of course, it would depend on your employer's timescales as well, and when things come actually to you. So approximately 4 months before your intended last day of service, you'd want to have that conversation with your employer, whether that's your line manager or HR department or payroll department, whoever is responsible for sending your application, to notify the scheme administrators of your intent to retire. So some employers ask for a longer amount of time than that, but on average, it's approximately 4 months notice that you'll need to give. So once you've notified your employer and had that conversation about your intent to retire, your employer will then notify civil service pensions of your last day of service. So it is your employer's responsibility when you're in active service to notify the scheme administrator of your intent to retire. So provided that we've got all that we need, civil service pensions will then create a retirement quote for you. Now, before that quote is sent to you, the data that's provided by employers will be checked and further information may be requested. So this is why we need such a long lead up time to creating someone's retirement quote, because we've got to check that all that information that we have to hand is correct, and then we can question or double check anything that we may have missing, because we want to create a full and accurate quotation for you. So again, provided that we have everything we need, approximately 2 months before your retirement date, you'll be sent a retirement quote in the post. Now, on this quote, it will detail for you how your pension has been calculated under the different scheme rules, your options for any lump sum, so what the maximum amount of lump sum that you'd be permitted to take is, and therefore how your pension will be reduced down accordingly. And there's also some acceptance paperwork. It's known as a personal details form that you'll need to fill out and send back in order for civil service pensions to put your pension into payment. So, of course, you must complete those accompanying forms that come with your quote and return those back to civil service pensions. We do prefer that you send the paperwork back by post. However, you can also send it back via email, but you must then include 2 extra forms of ID and a valid proof of address. And you must also give us consent to process your forms by email as well. So again, provided that we have everything that we need, your form will then be processed and your benefits will be put into payment. And then you'll also receive what we call a finalisation statement to confirm how much lump sum you've chosen and also how much pension you will receive. So remember, you're going to be in receipt then of your pension for the rest of your life. We'll also tell you the date that your pension will be paid on as well. So I've got an example here of a retirement quote. Now, of course, it's going to be personal to yourselves, and this is just to give an example, but we're sort of going to have a bit of a run through of the key things that you'll need to read on your retirement quote. It goes without saying, make sure you read your retirement quote carefully. And if you have any queries about the quote or how things have been calculated, you can always contact the scheme administrator as well. So there will be notes on the first page, as you can see here, to explain what is included in your quote. And for those that are affected by the 2015 remedy, your choices will also appear as well. Remember, as Joe said, from October of this year, that's when we can start to contact members with their quotation. So anyone retiring post-October of this year or is imminently retiring, you should also have your remedy choices included. So it will state for you clearly which option you're going to pick, whether it's option A for your legacy period or option B to keep it in your current Alpha pension scheme. Onto the personal details form, which is the form that you'll need to fill out in order for your pension to be put into payments. Again, your personal details will be pre-populated and will appear there. If there's anything missing or doesn't look right on your personal details, make sure you're telling us on the personal details form, but just make sure you initial any changes that you've made as well. Also on the retirement quote as well, it will detail for you how your pensionable earnings have been worked out, depending on the type of pension scheme that you were in. If you were in a final salary pension scheme, we'll detail for you how your reckonable service has been calculated and also what your final salary pension will be. Again, there will be some information about your lump sum options. So we'll detail if you do get a standard lump sum, if you were in the classic scheme, how much that will be. We'll also give you the options to include what the maximum amount of lump sum will be, and therefore you would need to reduce your pension down. For every £1 of pension that you choose to give up, you will get £12 back in lump sum. And then again, you've got your choice here where it will say whether you take all of your benefits as pension, whether you choose to take the maximum lump sum, or you could take a specified amount of lump sum as well, somewhere less than the maximum, and then your pension will be adjusted accordingly. We also detail about the percentage of lifetime allowance that this pension has used. So everyone had, before March of 2023, everyone had a limit to the amount of lifetime allowance that a person could accrue without then incurring a higher tax charge. And before March of 2023, that was £1,073,000 for everybody. However, recent changes in the March budget has abolished that higher tax charge for anyone who has breached that limit, but we would still include it on your retirement quotation. So having a look then at the personal details form, the bit that you'll need to fill out and send back to Civil Service Pensions so we can put your pension into payment. So again, you've got your personal details here. Again, anything that doesn't look right or needs amending, just make sure you're initialing that before you send it back. So check those details very carefully. You've then got your payment details. It goes without saying, but just make sure this part is completed. We once had a form sent back to us with just the word John written on it and no other details. And of course, we've got lots of Johns in the civil service, so we need to make sure we've got all your details present and correct. If details aren't there, it can delay things, and then your form will need to be sent back. So always double check the information before sending over your forms. Again, a box about your marital status. This is important because it could affect the pension benefits that you will be entitled to. For example, if you were entitled to a WPS refund, we'll need to know your marital status. If you're asked to include a certificate to confirm your marital status, whether that's a decree absolute or a marriage or death certificate, please make sure you're including it. We do prefer original copies. You can send certified copies, but again, you'll need to also send 2 forms of ID and a proof of address. So we do prefer originals, and of course we'll always send back your documents in the same manner that they've been received as well. Again, there may be some questions from HMRC with regard to lifetime allowance. It's going to ask you if you've got any other pensions in payment before the 6th of April 2006, and if so, tell us how much pension has been in payment. Again, if there's any questions, if you're in receipt of any pension after April 2006, you'll need to send a certificate from your other pension provider to show us how much lifetime allowance is used. Even though you're not, you may not be liable for the higher tax charge anymore, you may still need to include that information. And then finally, of course, you've got your signature and your date to declare that you want your pension putting into payment. Again, goes without saying, make sure that part is filled out correctly. You've also then got your lump sum option forms as well. So this is where you'll decide how much lump sum you would like based on the quote that's been given to you. You could opt for 0 lump sum if you were in the alpha scheme, or you could opt for the maximum, or again somewhere in between. Remember, with a classic pension scheme, your lump sum is automatically paid, but you might still be able to increase that by giving up part of your classic lump sum as well. But so you may end up, if you're a dual member with both classic and alpha, for example, 2 lump sum option forms in your paperwork. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through a personal details form. Now, there is obviously further support before you retire. If you haven't done so already, visit the scheme website for further information. It's got a wealth of articles and details on there and how you can prepare for retirement, including a really useful what to expect guide to give yourself an idea of the timescales that will be involved for retirement. If you haven't done so already, register for the online pension portal, a really useful tool, as Jo said before, to help you with your retirement planning. And you can always attend a pension power session as well. These are run very frequently, and we give a general overall view of the civil service pension scheme and what you need to know to help you with your preparation for retirement. You should also listen to the Civil Service Pension podcast as well. Series 1 has been online for about a year now, and there are 6 episodes in Series 1. Series 2 is currently being released. You download these episodes directly from the Civil Service Scheme website or via your music provider. And each episode discusses a different topic about the Civil Service Pension Scheme. We also speak to real life civil servants who have recently retired or partially retired about their own experiences as well. So well worth a listen. And the episodes are only about half an hour long and completely free to download. And then finally, you should make your retirement plan. So if you've had a little something to drink over the weekend, I don't recommend you make your retirement plan then. However, it's a really good idea to maybe sit down one night and just work out your retirement plan. So use the retirement living standards to work out in terms of income. Make sure you're doing your research in terms of the emotional and mental side of retiring as well. So all that together, not just the financial part, but also the emotional and physical impacts that retirement can have. Make sure you've got your plan together. My mum has recently retired from the civil service, and she built up a little document about how to retire, a complete civil service move there, making sure she's got everything to hand. So there is support for you after you retire as well. Now, you can still use the Civil Service Pension Portal even after you've retired from the civil service, and you can use it to update your details. You can also view and check your pay slips for your monthly pension payments. You'll also receive a P60 at the end of the financial year to tell you the amount of pension that's been paid, and also of any pension increases that may be applicable as well. And you'll also have access to news and information about your civil service pension via the pensioner newsletter. This tends to come out on a quarterly basis, and it gives a lot of updates about the civil service pension scheme. I just want to highlight some extra help and support that you might want to consider after you have retired from the civil service. So firstly, there is the Civil Service Pensioners Alliance. So they are there to support ex-civil servants. There's about 50,000 members that are registered to the Civil Service Pension Alliance all over the UK and also abroad as well. They've got a branch in Malta, which I'm very jealous about. So they are there to, like I say, support ex-civil servants. They have an AGM once a year as well, and that can influence on policy. There is going to be a short video after the end of this session as well to give you more detail about the Civil Service Pension Alliance. So make sure you're watching that video if you're interested. Also, we've got the Civil Service Retirement Fellowship. This is a national befriending scheme that puts ex-civil servants in touch with one another. The aim of the game is to combat loneliness in later life, and they also run educational speaking courses and days out. They also have a support helpline as well if things are getting a little bit tough. Finally, we've got the Charity for Civil Servants. Again, ex-civil servants can use this as well as those in active service. So if things are becoming a bit tough, the Charity for Civil Servants will offer practical, emotional and financial advice and support. And if you just type into a search engine, the Charity for Civil Servants, you'll find further information. So we are at the end of our session, and thank you so much for listening, but we now have some time for some questions. So I'm going to hand you back to Catherine and we can have a look at some of the questions that you've been asking. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Helen. That was wonderful. Really nice to have that walkthrough of the retirement process and the application form, as it is something which can look a little bit daunting when retirement does come. We've had lots of questions in, about 250 so far. Thank you so much. We've got about 25 minutes to answer as many of those as we possibly can, and we're focusing on the most upvoted questions. As I mentioned in the little break in the middle, the information on the retirement living standards has been shared in the chat if you want to pick up some information around how those are calculated. I've also shared the link to where you can book a pension power session if you're interested in attending one of those. And also where you can watch all the other Pension Awareness Month sessions that we've delivered so far on the dedicated Pension Awareness Month pages of the scheme website. So all of that is there that you can get those links and refer back to after the session if you would like. So I'll come to you, Jo, with our first question, which is from Kath. It says, yesterday you mentioned if you retire a day before your 60th birthday to avoid any actuarial reduction. What was this about, please, Jo? If you could pick up when someone can retire to avoid any reduction to their pension benefits, please.
Hi, yeah. So what this was getting at is essentially just fine-tuning the day that you use to retire from, essentially. Now, the key date is which is the first date of your retirement. So the date that you actually retire is the last day that you're actually in service. So in this case, the question from yesterday was basically asking what is the first day that you can retire without getting any form of actuarial retirement. The answer to that is the day before your, say, 60th birthday, because the first day of your retirement will then be when you're 60. So at that point, no reduction will be applied. Any amount of time before then that you retire, potentially reduction would be due. So if you'd retired a couple of days before your birthday, for example, technically, there could be a very small actuarial reduction applied to that pension. In realistic terms, that would be fairly insignificant. But in practical terms, you want to claim your pension as soon as possible. You want the first day of your retirement to be the first day that you are 60 or 67, whatever the applicable age is.
Thank you, Jo. Yeah, that's great. Just a little note on the reduction that gets applied to your pension at point of retirement. So every month older you get, any reduction that applies to your pension would lessen. So in that scenario that Jo just talked about, if you went a few days, for example, before your 60th birthday, taking benefits from Classic, Classic Plus or Premium, the reduction that applied would be for you being 59 and 11 months. So if you were 59 and 10 months, the reduction would be a little bit greater, and so on and so on. So every month older you get, any reduction lessens. But like Jo said, last day of service being the day before the date you're able to claim your pension, and then your birthday being the day you can then have your first day of your retirement on your birthday, with leaving work behind without any reduction being applied to your pension benefits. So hopefully that clears things up there. Helen, I'll come to you with our next question, which comes from Angela. She said, I'm thinking of retiring next May when I will be 60. Do I receive my classic pension, then get the alpha at 67? Does the alpha pension get sorted automatically, or do I have to apply? So Helen, how does that work, please?
Okay, so thanks, Anne, for your question. So if you're going to apply for your classic pension, what will happen is you'll have it detailed on your retirement form in terms of what your classic pension will be, how it's been calculated at the age that you wish to retire. Because you may have linked service, so you've got your classic and alpha pension together, it may also detail what your alpha pension would be, but obviously at that age there may be a reduction applied to it if you take your alpha pension below your normal pension age. But you can choose not to put your alpha pension into payment if you don't want to. There will be an option to say, I just want to take my classic benefits at 60. Then if you've left the civil service without claiming your alpha pension, you can then apply to the civil service pension scheme directly to put the remainder of your alpha pension into payment at the date that you wish to. And again, you'll still need to give that 4-month timescale to put any remainder of pension into payment. So essentially, we can't force you to take your pension. We can't put a pension into payment without you telling us to do so. So there will be an option on your paperwork to say which part of your pension you're going to put into payments at that age. I hope that's answered your question. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, that's great. And I think that will apply in all scenarios. Your civil service pension doesn't automatically go into payment. You need to tell us. And the same will apply with all other pension benefits out there. That also includes your state pension, just to factor that in. That's not going to go into payment automatically when you reach state pension age. You will need to contact the pension service at DWP to claim it. So just another important thing to factor in if you hadn't considered that as part of your the process that you need to go through when you are retiring. Okay, so our next question for you, Joe, is about classic final salary pension. So is it calculated using earnings from the previous 12 months or the precise salary at point of retirement? So how does that work, please?
So in terms of your classic pension, I'll go back a little stage on this just for anybody that's not familiar with how this works in the first place. But for the classic plus and premium schemes, when you leave, the pay that we use to calculate that pension is used on your pay at the point of leaving. So although most of you will have switched over to Alpha last year, we're still looking at your current pay now to work out those pensions. Now, what we do for the classic scheme in particular is from the day that you leave, we look back 3 years from that date. So if that was next year, for example, we'd be looking back 3 years from that date. And somewhere within that 3-year window, we would be looking for the best year's worth of pay that we can find. And that's what you were paid over the course of the whole year. Now, for many people, that will probably be the last 12 months. In many instances, people's salary will just keep increasing year on year, and therefore often the last 12 months will be the most beneficial. So in those circumstances, what you will get is the pay based on what you actually paid over that 12-month period. So for most people, that's probably a combination of at least 2 different rates of salary. It's not just the final salary rate that you are on at the point that you leave. It's what you actually earned over that year-long period. So I hope that's answered your question, and I will pass back to Catherine.
Thanks, Joe. That was nice and clear. We've got a question from Mark next. I'll come to you with Helen. So he said, I have mostly a classic pension. I have read that to help avoiding paying as much tax on your lump sum, it is best to keep your lump sum to a minimum as you pay tax on 75% of your lump sum. Is it possible to take a nil lump sum and your total amount as pension only? So there's a little bit of misinformation there, and we just need to clarify the situation, if you could, please.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I have come across that question before. You're right. I think there's a little bit of misinformation sort of out there. So when you retire from the civil service pension scheme, your lump sum is paid to you tax-free. Even if you do decide to take the maximum amount of lump sum, that can still be paid tax-free. With regard to the second part of your question, what you can't do when you retire from the classic pension scheme is just opt for a lump sum and not put your pension into payment. They both have to be, they both have to be put into payments at the same time. So there's no option to not take a lump sum from the classic scheme because that is automatically paid to you at the point that you retire from classic. It's normally 3 times your pension as the standard lump sum. But again, you do have the choice to give up some of your pension to increase your lump sum. But like I say, lump sums are paid in the civil service tax free. So even if you do decide to increase your lump sum, that is still paid to you tax free. I hope that information's helped, and thanks. Back to you, Catherine.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, that's great. So just to add on to that, there are other types of pension out there where you could take 100% of your pension pot as a lump sum at retirement and essentially wipe out all of your pension benefits, just take it as a one-off lump sum. The civil service pension scheme doesn't allow you to do that, but some defined contribution schemes out there in the private sector do allow you to do that. And in that circumstance, only 25% of that lump sum would be tax-free. The remaining 75% would be taxable. So that might be where the confusion lies. But in the civil service pension scheme, all of the lump sum that we're going to pay you will be paid to you tax-free. And a lot of people choose to take a lump sum to minimise the tax they'll actually pay on their pension in retirement. But of course, it's a personal choice depending on what works best for you. We have a question for you now, Joe. So someone has said, if you have submitted partial retirement or a request for partial retirement, can you amend when your quote is received? So presumably maybe amend the number of hours per week or the change to their working pattern that they've proposed. So Joe, what's the situation there, please?
Okay, there's a few different things that we could be talking about here. So I'll give a a general answer about the situation. So partial retirement is obviously based on you initially being old enough to claim your pension and then doing something to your job that is resulting in a 20% drop in your earnings. And for most people, that's going part-time. Now, the whole process is driven by your job. So one of the key things is agreeing that change of working patterns and a suitable date with your employer. And that changing is then subject to negotiation with your employer. It's something that we act under instruction from, and we will be responding to that job change rather than the other way around. If you're wanting to change details about exactly what hours you're working or when that's going to take impact from, the first point of contact from that will be your employer, and then we will act under instruction in those circumstances. Now, the standard process for issuing those quotes is that we need 4 months notice of that being put into payment. We will then take 2 months to discuss any amendments or updated data that we need with your employer, and we will issue you a quote 2 months ahead of the date that we've been given. Now, if that is to be amended, particularly if the process is already in place, that can lead to issues with paperwork and payment dates being paid on time. So whilst it would be possible, depending on the exact circumstances and depending specifically on your employer's actions, it is potentially possible, but it could cause delays. I hope that answers your question, and I will pass back to Catherine.
Thank you, Joe. That was good. OK, so let's have a look. I think we might have answered a couple of these. So we've got, can I retire at 60 and claim my classic pension, but continue working part-time in the civil service contributing to Alpha, which isn't payable till 67? So we've confirmed, yep, you can do that. You have to take partial retirement if you wanted to access your pension and remain in the civil service, and then you could claim your Alpha at 67 if you chose not to claim it at the same time as partial retirement. So yeah, that's an option. A question there. So I want to partially retire next August and the remedy period affects me. The calculator and my ABS are not going to be ready in time for me to get an estimate of what I'll be due under Alpha or Premium. How can I get a projection of what I might be due without having to submit an actual request for partial retirement? So the modeler isn't ready to be to do the full 2015 remedy calculations yet, the modeler. And we do have the retirement benefits illustrator available on the scheme website, which gives you an indication of the benefits that are payable for the 7-year remedy period. And there are some updates being made to that at the moment as well. So that's going to be improved on the version that exists at the moment. That's there as a short-term measure. But unfortunately, at the moment, there isn't anything in place. I think the best way to look at this really is the information that's on your annual benefit statement at the moment is very likely to be a sort of worst case scenario in terms of the pension that you're likely to receive under the 2015 remedy. If making the change back to your legacy scheme or moving into Alpha gives you a lower pension figure, then of course you're just not going to go for that option that pays you a lower pension at retirement. So it should be a case of the figures that you're seeing at the moment, you can work with those as a good estimate. They shouldn't really get any lower, but they might get higher. So you can at least work with that as a worst case scenario. But we're doing as much as we can to try and make sure that the new version of the modeler will be available as soon as possible. So we don't have an agreed date yet when that is going to be ready, when the development will be complete and all the testing will be completed. But we're working to get it out there as soon as we possibly can. So do bear with us while we try and get that done. Helen, I'll come to you with our next question. Kim has asked, what's the difference between qualifying and reckonable service? If you could explain that for us, please.
Sure, that is a really, really popular question that we get when we're asked when we do our training sessions. I'm just going to give some basic definitions then of qualifying service and reckonable service. So your qualifying service is simply the length of time you've been a member of the civil service pension scheme, and it determines whether you're eligible to actually be in receipt of a civil service pension at retirement. You need to have at least 2 years of qualifying service to actually be eligible to receive a civil service pension. So if you were a part-time worker or a full-time worker, a week of qualifying service is still the same, so regardless of what your working pattern is. Now, your reckonable service is the service that counts towards the calculation of a final salary pension scheme, so whether that's classic or premium or classic plus. So there are certain periods that won't count towards reckonable service, and I'll give you a couple of examples. If you work If you've had any time off due to a career break, for example, or if you've had any time off with unpaid sick leave, or if you've had any time off due to industrial action, those periods would not count towards your reckonable service. As well, if you're a part-time worker, your reckonable service is prorated based on the amount of actual hours you've worked. So your reckonable service is the service used in the calculation of a final salary pension scheme, but your qualifying service is simply the length of time you've been a member of the pension scheme. I hope that definition's helped. Back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Helen. That's great. Just a little add to that, that the 2 years of qualifying service isn't scheme specific. So we have had some questions from people saying I won't have 2 years in Alpha when I retire, as I moved into Alpha on the 1st of April 22. The 2-year qualifying period doesn't start again when you moved schemes. It counts for all of your service. So in that scenario, you will still qualify for a pension, even if when you leave, you actually have less than 2 years in the Alpha scheme, if you've chosen your legacy scheme for the 2015 remedy period. So hopefully that clarifies that point, which I think we've had some other questions about as well. Joe, our next question. So someone has asked, is the classic part of my pension based on my salary at the time when classic ended? You can just clarify that, please.
Hi, so we touched on this earlier, but classic and premium and classic plus actually as well. The pay that's used is back from the day that you leave, not from the day that you switched over into Alpha. So if you're a classic to Alpha member, for example, you switched over last year and you don't leave for 4 years, we will be looking back in 4 years from that date to work out your pay. So any pay increases you get now will be affecting the rate of pay that's used to calculate that older pension. Hope that's answered that question. I'll pass back to Catherine.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, the final salary link remains in place as long as you remain in service, essentially, so you'll still feel the benefit of any future promotions or pay rises. Helen, a question from Andrew. When I retire, will my pension increase annually in line with inflation? How does that work?
Yes, thank you for that question. So again, really popular with members who are retiring. So your pension does go up in line with inflation once it's in payment. There's just something that you might need to consider though. So in terms of the inflation, it would depend at what time of the year you've actually retired, whether you get a full increase or just a partial increase on your pension. Now, as I mentioned before, you are sent a P60 at the end of a financial year to show you the amount of pension that's been paid and also what any future increases will be as well. But it's just worth noting, if you've retired sort of halfway through a year, you're not going to get a full increase on that pension. It will be prorated based on when you actually retired. So I hope that answer's helped. Back to you, Catherine.
Thanks, Helen. Yeah, the first year after retiring, your inflation adjustment will be prorated, but obviously you'll get the full increase all subsequent years after that. So it is linked to inflation, and it's CPI, the consumer price index, that's used to increase all of our civil service pensions in payment. I'll pick up the next question, which says, I'm 56 and have 24 years in classic. I'll be leaving the service on the 31st of March and I'm not planning to take my pension until I reach 60. Is it best I choose classic for my 2015 remedy, as I can then take my full pension at 60 with 31 years service without any reduction? Really, that will depend on the figures that are provided to you. So for some people, it might be those 7 years worth remedy period might be best in their classic scheme or whatever their legacy scheme was before moving into Alpha. For others, it might be better to have those benefits in Alpha and actually have them reduced and still pay them at age 60. In some circumstances, Alpha will still give a higher figure, even retiring early, but for others it might be classic. So there's no cut and dried answer to that question really. It will just simply depend on your personal circumstances as to which choice is better. But when the time comes, you'll be given both sets of figures, so it'll be really clear which option is going to be most beneficial to you. Okay, so hopefully that gives some guidance, although we can't directly answer that question. And then Joel, comes to you, this one from Liz. So as classic is based on final salary upon retirement and salary hasn't routinely kept up with inflation, am I right that the best way to raise the classic bit of your pension, if you have a lot of years, is to get a promotion a good year before you intend to leave? Joel, what are your thoughts on that, please?
That's a great leading question as to the best way to raise my pension. Essentially, there's a few different things to consider here. So by default, the basic value of the classic pension, you're right, that's going up. The service part of that is frozen. So the biggest thing that's having an impact on your older pension is now your pay. Now, pay rates in that respect varying greatly department to department, as we know, depending on what's happening with you and how your personal pay is being increased, particularly for somebody on mark time, for example. You may not be seeing big jumps in that. A promotion is obviously going to bring with it a substantial pay rise. That is going to affect your classic pension, and that will produce then an increase in that older pension. You do have other things that you could do as well, such as buying added pension in the intervening period as well. That would also allow you to increase the total amount of pension you've got in your alpha pension, I should say, at that point, and also AVCs, which will boost the overall value as well. Directly in terms of affecting your classic pension, anything that increases your pay in that respect is going to have a positive impact, so long as that increase is pensionable. And on that note, I will pass back to Catherine to round up.
Thanks very much, Joe, for that. That is all of the questions we've got time for today. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. I hope you found today's session useful. As we've mentioned, it is recorded and it will be able to be played back on the Civil Service Pension Scheme website from Monday. If we haven't got to your question, apologies. We have tried to answer as many as we possibly can. Remember, we do have the Pension Power webinars available that you can sign up to attend. Give you 1 hour on the basics of the Civil Service Pension Scheme, and we'll pick up any questions that you have on there as well. We will be sending out a feedback survey this afternoon, so do please take some time to fill that in and tell us what you thought of today's session, what was good, what wasn't so good. We'll use your feedback to shape any future sessions that we have. And we're going to finish off by playing a video about the Civil Service Pensioners Alliance for you, just to give you a little bit more information about what is a great organisation. You can join them whilst you're still in service, once you're over the age of 50, or you can join when you're a pensioner as well. So we'll leave with that. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Bye for now.